So what we need to do is pretty natural, right? So after we define a flow, ST flow, right? Any way of assigning the weights that makes it looks like a realistic flow would be a flow function, right? So after we define the flow function, we can talk about the value of the flow function, right? So intuitively, it's really just the amount of water we manage to push out from S, right? It's also the amount of water we manage to push back to T, right? So basically, now for here, you can sort of do a back of envelope calculation, right? You sort of see that if I sum up all this number is 25. If I sum up all these three numbers, it's also 25, right? So basically, because, right, we can sort of see that because of the flow conservation constraint, right? So intuitively, the flow is not going to disappear in the middle of nowhere, right? So long as we manage to push out some flow, right? Eventually, you have to travel across all the nodes and eventually arrive T because of the flow conservation. You cannot disappear, right? That's also like in the middle of the transportation, no new flow will be introduced. That we won't see the flow won't be amplified at any node, right? So that's also the reason that that's together with the fact that like no flow is going to disappear, we sort of can see that the amount of flow you push out is exactly the same as the amount of flow you sort of suck in T, right? So the value of the flow basically can be defined as, if I count the number of flow that's really being pushed out from S to the number of flow that's being pushed into S, right? So if I take the difference, it's the value, right? So if I use this as an example, right? This picture as example, the value of the flow is exactly 25. You can calculate the value that's being pushed out from S. You can also calculate the value that's being that's being sucked by the sink, right? So just notice that here we really have two terms. The first term is E out of S, and the second term is E into S, right? So for our particular case, right, the out of we really have the out of S is really just the sum of these three. But in S, right? So if you look at this node, right, there's nothing coming in, right? So the in S is 0. In general, this may not necessarily be true, right? So let's think about the one flow, like that's a little bit of behaving silly, but that's sort of allowed, right? So let's see that we have S is over here, T is over here, right? So let's say that I push 2 units of flow and out, right? So when I push this 2 unit of flow out, right? So 1 unit, right, gets circulate back, and the other unit really continue to be pushed towards T, right? So this would be the way the eventually only 1 unit of flow that arrives to T, right? And then similar, and also like this is the we also push the flow moving from another path, right? But this is a more obvious one. 1 unit of flow that's moving from the path that's highlighted by the purple curve, right? So now here, now the one interesting thing happens, right? So if I use this formulation here and count the outgoing flow, it's really 2 plus 1, right? So 2 sort of maps to here, right? Let me just use a smaller font, right? 2 is maps to here, and 1 is maps to here, right? So this is the outgoing. But now, just as you can see that there's an incoming edge, right? So we need to be careful a bit, right? A bit careful here, right? So we also need to minus the total amount that's incoming, right? So E gets into S, right? This edge satisfies the requirement. This edge E gets into goes back to S, and then now I sort of want to calculate the flow that's moving from this E node connecting from whatever node to S, right? So this one, because there's 1 unit of flow that's circulating back, right? We need to minus 1. So eventually the total flow value is 2 here, right? So it's also intuitive, right? So I push out 2 unit of flow, but eventually 1 gets circulated back. And on top of that, I push out another unit of flow on another pass, right? So eventually 3 units of flow goes out, but then I collect 1 unit of flow back, right? So that means that 2 unit of flow that's finally arrived to T, right? That's also consistent with our calculation, 1 unit, and then we sum them up is 2 unit, right? So just remember that, right? So so when we really want to calculate the value of the flow, right, sometimes we sort of need to include so in most of the time this term is zero, but it's really just that the definition of a flow allows the non-zero case to happen. Let me also just explain why in most of the cases the flow is zero, needs to be zero, right? Just imagine what's going on here, right? So there's 1 unit of flow that's doing well, right? That's directly gets into T, right? But there's another unit of flow that's like we sort of doing some sort of strange, some sort of things that's really wasting resources. I push out 1 unit to here, 1 unit back, back to, let's call this node A, and one from A to S, like the flow, right, eventually move back to S, right? Just look at this cycle, right? So 1 unit of flow goes out, yeah, and eventually comes in, right? So you really just feel you really just feels that you want to travel from Williamsburg to eventually your destination, say it's New York. But then what you have been doing is that you travel to Washington, and then you travel to York, Virginia, and then you travel back, right? So this kind of traveling is really, that doesn't help us to increase the amount of water that we can push through from S to T, right? So in case this kind of cycle exists, it's safe to remove, right? So this is the point, the major point is safe to remove, right? Safe to remove, right? Remove. When it's safe to remove, that really just means that in case we sort of come up with a flow where this term is non-zero, we can always remove some meaningless flows that's circulating from S back to itself. After that, this flow, this term becomes zero, right? So just let me just repeat, right? For the purpose of defining the flow functions rigorously, we have to consider the term that corresponds to bringing back the water that's pushed out of S, right? So mathematically this needs to be allowed. But when we want to design a flow algorithm, it really just doesn't make sense to really have a cycle. It's really just like when you design the shortest path, when you have a positive cycle, this is never going to do well, right? So you can always remove the cycle and come up with a simpler solution, right? This kind of argument also works here, right? So if we want to maximize the flow we can push through the network, then it's always smart to not to introduce a cycle, right? So at least if the flow's value remain the same, at least the one without cycle has a simpler solution, right? So this is how we really mathematically define the notion of flow. Right. So after we define everything, right, so we can really just sort of try to understand what is the max flow problem. The max flow problem is, right, just to find a flow which is really just the function f, right, which is really just the function f, right. After we find the flow, like we want the value of f to be maximized, right. So this is exactly what we sort of want to do here. So it turns out the value of the flow in this network is 25. We cannot. It's sort of actually 28, right? So we somehow it's really a bit better than what we have been doing here, right? It's 28, and that's actually the best that we can do, right? And so in terms of the algorithm problem, if you are given a flow graph that's directed, weighted, and there's one node that's labeled as S, another node that's labeled as T, then your goal is to be able to design a flow, or intuitively is the way you circulate the water, so that the value of the flow or the amount of water you can circulate. Now let's move to another closely related problem to this kind of flow network network or network flow problem, right? So it's what people call the minimum cut problem, right? So the minimum cut. So So the cut problem is a bit like at least in terms of the mathematical property, it's easier, right? So let's really just read this out loud, right? So an SD card is a partition of the nodes where S belongs to A and T belongs to B. So now the center concept here is really what we call the partition, right? Partition basically is that if I look at all the nodes here, right? So what I'm going to do is really just that I'm going to chop things into two half, right? So one half, it's this one half is called A, the other half is called B, right? So any cut, right? Any way of chopping things into two halves, into two halves would be called ST cut, so long as one of the component contains S, the other component contains T, right? So basically we really just want to chop the entire network into two pieces so that S is within one piece and T is within the other piece, right? So long as this condition is held, like we call that an ST cut, right? But if we chop the component into two pieces so that S and T belong to the same piece, then it's not called ST cut, right? So let me give you an example, right? So if I chop the component entire graph in this way, right? So this is not an ST cut, right? Because S and T are in the same component, right? So another thing you need to pay attention to is that like even this picture, it's a bit misleading, right? So even this picture is giving you an example that, right, when you chop things into two half, right? So that the component that's containing S has to be physically together, right? So it sort of give you an illusion that whenever you chop things, you have to make the subgraph that's containing S to be connected, right? So this is an illusion, right? A has to be connected, right? This is actually not needed, right? So what does that mean, right? We can really sort of construct a very funny way of partitioning, right? So let's say that I can partition the way, so use red nodes and also the green nodes to let me just use red and node to label A and B, right? So any nodes that's labeled as red as A, then any nodes that's labeled as green as B, right? So we can sort of have this kind of partitioning, right? So and that's it, right? So let's say that A equal to S is here, right? Let's go call this as V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6, and T, right? So we can sort of let A to be S, V4, V5, right? So this is this corresponds to all these three red nodes, right? So and we can sort of let the rest of them to be B, right? So these are all the B nodes, right? So B equal to V1, V2, V3, V6, and the T, right? So V1 is here, V2 is here, V3 is here, V6 is here, T is here, right? So sort of you can see that we are still chopping all the nodes into two components, but now it's that we do, so now it's actually the component A is really sort of disconnected, right? These are the A's, right? These are the A's. They don't form a connected component. Right? That's totally allowed, right? So now after we define that, right? So this is allowed. After we define the partition ST cut, then we can talk about the capacity of the ST cut, right? So what is the capacity of the ST cut? The capacity of ST cut is really just that if I let's see if I really just so sorry that there was a bit of interruptions. So let's really just repeat what is the how can we define the capacity of a cut, right? So this is also pretty straightforward concept. Basically the capacity of the cuts, you really just should look into the look at the entire A set A and I'm just counting the number of edges that's coming, just counting all the edges that's coming out of A, right? So when I say coming out of A, really just said that one end is in A, and the other end is outside A, right? Right, so all these three edges are coming out of A, like for this particular case, right? This is A and this is B, right? This is B here, right? So, and the capacity is really just that if I look at all these numbers, right, I can just sum them up, right? This is my capacity. And sum them up, this is my capacity. This is 10 plus A plus 16, which is 34, right? So this is the what's written over here, right? So that's the capacity, right? So now next we can also try to examine the funny things, right? So what we did just now is that if we have a regular, right, we sort of have the entire block, then the entire A set is connected, right? So it looks intuitive to define the capacity, right? So now let's also just look into the definition the more funny definition we have just now. So where the entire A set is not really connected, right? So let's really just look at the what we did just now. We sort of say that let's say this three nodes belongs to A, right? So if A equal to all these three nodes, right? So I'm not really going to relabel them, right? Just imagine these are all these three nodes, right? So how can we define the capacity, right? So now B are really just the nodes that are here, right? So let me just also color the B's. Right, so these are all the B's, right? So now I also want to need to find all the edges that are moving from A to B, right? So this is the first edge that's moving from A to B, and this is the second edge that's moving from A to B, and this is the third edge that's moving from A to B, right? And now this is fourth edge, and this is fifth edge, right? So now if I want to compute the capacity, right, I just want to use 10 plus, right? So what's over here? Let me just erase that and see. It's not written, right? So 10 plus whatever. Let me just making things out. 10, 4, 6, 4, and 5, and 2, 3, right? So when I compute the capacity of the A and B, where A is really defined by these red nodes, it's really just that 10 plus 6 plus 4 plus 5 plus 3. Right, those are all the 5 numbers, right? So if I look at other edges, say if I look at this edge, right? So this is an edge that's connecting from B to B, right? That's not really the E out of A, right? This is not our definition, right? So, and actually, right? So we sort of make the mistake. There's also one very subtle edge that's moving from here, moving back, right? So let's say this edge capacity is 7 again, then we need to add 7, right? So you really just need to be very careful in really examining every single edge. To actually we make quite a number of mistakes, right? So let me just erase everything and just highlight all the edges we want, right? So let me even use a bolder font, right? So a bit bolder, right? So this will be the first one we care about, the second one, the third one, right? So if I look at this edge, doesn't count. This is actually moving from B to A. Actually, this doesn't count. B to B doesn't count. B to B doesn't count, and A to B again, right? So this counts, right? And this doesn't count, right? This actually counts. This actually counts, right? This actually doesn't count. This counts, this doesn't count, right? It's everything that counts are really just I need to add back all the numbers, right? So actually the only thing I missed just now is let's say this is another 7, right? Just I need to add 7, right? So I'm adding up all these numbers. 7 here, 3 here, 5 here, and 7 here. That gives me the capacity between A and B, right? So actually the moral of the story is really just that like there are some cases where if you just physically chop that into 2 halves so that each half is a connected component, then the capacity is usually easier to compute, right? So if you just really So next, after we define an ST cut and the capacity associated with an ST cut, then another optimization function we want to study is that we want to examine how we can design an algorithm to find the minimum cut, right? So basically, I want to find a cut, an ST cut that minimize the capacity, right? So let me just write this down a bit easier, right? So find a ST cut that minimizes the capacity, right? So this is an ST cut. It's not really just an arbitrary cut, right? And it turns out that for this particular instance, the minimum cut is really just that this particular components here, the A is over here, right? So let me just give you a bit of the intuition why we care. Like we talk about the max flow, and then we talk about the mean cut, right? So let me just start with giving you some intuition why these are related, right? So imagine that you just going back to the setting that imagine you're really just trying to push through the network flow, right? The flow, push through the waters through a pipeline network, right? So let's say this is a network of pipelines, right? So when you just observe the network of pipelines, right? So the network of pipeline basically means that you are given a flow network. Flow network basically means that you are given the graph together with the edge capacity, together with S and together with T. It's actually like before we start even talking about the algorithm, right? How can we design an algorithm to find the maximum flow? Let's really just imagine some of the fundamental limits of this network, right? So imagine that if I am a very very powerful monster, right? So I don't know, like I'm a very powerful monster. I'm trying to draw a dragon, right? So and then I'm so powerful so that I'm actually, let's just imagine this is an island, right? So those are just seas. There are seas, right? So so near the island, right? So if I'm a very powerful monster, if I'm somehow managed to cut that island into two halves, right? So but after I cut the island into two halves, somehow you sort of assume that all these pipelines are really robust, right? Right? So basically, even after I cut things into these two halves, right? So now S and T are no longer in the same island, but the pipeline is not broken, right? So imagine that we have this setting, right? So now we sort of want to understand with now really we haven't changed the pipeline per se, but we sort of like physically separated T and S into two different smaller islands, right? So if we view things in this way, we can actually it becomes sort of immediate what would be the limit, the capacity limit, or of the entire transportation network, right? So let me just repeat what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that without really touching the network, let's just imagine that we physically chop the island into two halves, right? Just by chopping things in this way, we can sort of start to get a bit of intuition how much flow we can push through, right? In the sense that you can really just view that now I sort of have two islands. Those are really the bridges, right? So let me just use a different color, right? So these are really the bridges that's connecting the two islands, right? The bridges connecting to the two islands. Right. So now if after I chop this off, right? So imagine that this is the S island containing S, right? This is the first island, and this is the T island, right? So this is a T, right? This is T, right? There are really just certain amount of bridges that can help me to move water from left to right, right? So of course there are some bridges that can connect from right to left. But those are really not that relevant, right? So the most relevant things are really just those bridges that are moving from S to T, right? So if I just count the capacity sum of all the bridges, say this is 10, this is 11. 11, sorry. This is 11. This is 13, right? So if I have three big bridges and then I have three capacity limit, that really just means that in total, I really can transport 13 plus 10 plus 11 water from left to right, right? So the entire intuition is that when I break S and T into two islands, whatever way you are going to transport the water from S to T, you have to use the bridge that's connecting two islands. but there are just really just that many of bridges, right? In this particular case, maybe there are really just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are just 5 bridges, right? So if there are just 5 bridge, and I also know the capacity limit of each of the bridges, then I know that there's a capacity limit. I sum up all this number, right? If the number is 50, that really just means that regardless how smart am I, I'm not going to be able to transport more than 50 units of water from S of to T, right? Because these are really just the bridge limit. You cannot really just move water without going through the bridge. And the bridge can only allow you to transport like 50 units of water, right? So there's no way out, right? The 50 unit is your upper bound, right? So now, what so if you look at this, if you look at this, what I'm actually doing, right? So what I'm actually really doing is I'm really computing the capacity of the ST this cut, right? So when my powerful monster is really doing the cut, right? So we cut things into 2 halves, right? It's really just correspond to an S and T cut, right? After my monster create an S and T cuts, when I compute the capacity over here, it's literally corresponding to, I'm counting the number of bridges that are crossing from one island that's containing S to another island that's containing T. Not only I'm counting that, I'm even counting that the capacity for every single bridge. And I'm summing up all the capacity for every single bridge. Then that's actually a limit, a very hard limit on the amount of water I can transport from S to T, right? This is intuitively how max flow and mean cut is related, right? So, but there's another interesting thing that's worth mentioning, right? So, just imagine that, right? So I have an island, that's an S, that's T, right? My monster can cut. Right, if I have a very powerful monster, right, my monster can really cut things in an arbitrary way, right? The first time monster can cut things in this way, then I can connect the bridge, I can count the bridges in this way, right? So, but the second time, the monster may just decide that let me just not to cut things in this way, right? So let me just cut things in a second way, right? So the second time maybe it really just cuts through this way, right? So when it cuts through a different way, then we have different set of bridges, right? The bridge configurations will be different, right? So, but for every single legitimate cut, it's actually a legitimate upper bound of the maximum number of flows we can push through, right? So when we cut, right, when we make the optimum cut, right, when somehow we manage to cut the entire island in a way so that the number of bridges or the total amount of capacity that can go through the bridge is minimized, then basically that's the best lower bound we can impose or we can know about the maximum flow, right? So for instance, if my mean cut looks like that, right? So if this is the mean cut, right? And somehow the mean across the mean cut, I sort of know that the capacity of the mean cut is like it's only 8. Then I sort of know that A is the minimum, is actually an upper bound of the flow we can use, right? So there's I'm sort of trying to show that the mean cut has to be larger than the max flow, right? So this is actually one direction that's actually easier to prove, right? So so basically I can just try to make my monster to be smarter, to make sure that I chop this island into really the most nasty possible way, right? So that there are not really that many of bridges that's connecting from A to B, right? So in this case, I sort of able to highlight the fundamental limits of this network, right? So fundamental limits, it's really just in the sense that like we really just cannot push more flow than the number of bridges that's available on the mean cut, right? Right, so this is how the mean. So this is at the high level intuitively how the max flow and mean cut is related, and then why do we want to describe this two problems in general altogether, right? So what's more surprising, right? So let me just give you a preview, right? Not only the mean cut is an upper bound of the max flow, it's actually equal. Right, so when it's an upper bound, this is what we call the weak duality, right? So basically, it's really just by looking at the story that's written here. If you just inspect that carefully, like everyone will say, you will just believe that, oh, of course, that's very intuitive. Mean flow has to be larger than the max club, right? All right, but what's less intuitive and what's really making this problem really exciting is that the max flow is actually exactly the same of mean flow, mean cut, right? So max flow equal to mean cut equal to max flow, right? That's actually the most exciting part of the whole story, right? So this is actually what we are going to do in this lecture and the next lecture to gradually unfold the structure over here to convince you these two are the same quantities, right? But at this moment, right, so this is only the preview at this so far, right? So we don't need to worry too much about how the detailed structure between mean flow and max cloud, right? You really just need to understand that intuitively they are connected in this way. And then for now, the more important thing is that we really need to make sure that we do have correct understanding. We do understand the concept correctly, right? So I usually don't walk through the quizzes, right? So some of the quizzes are silly, but for this one, right, let's really just walk through that, right? So let's really just look at this graph, right? So this is the entire graph we are interested in, right? So now the slides is saying that let's really partition this graph into two halves, right? All the black nodes are called A portion, right? So this is the definition of A, right? So and all the white nodes are called B set, right? So let's first verify that this is the ST cut. Right. In order to verify that, it's pretty straightforward, right? We sort of know that S belongs to A and T belongs to B, right? So we make sure that S and T do not belong to the same partition of the graph, right? So this is an ST cut, right? Let's say that this is straightforward. Now, after we have the ST cut, we sort of want to compute the capacity. Right. So when we compute the capacity, it's really just that, as we saw just now, is E out of A and then the capacity of E, right? So let's calculate what are the out of, right? So out of, right? So this edge is out of, right? And this edge is not out of, this edge is not out of, right? This is from B to A, right? So this is not out of, this is not out of, this is also B to A, not out of, but this is from A to B, right? And then the rest of them are not out of, right? So actually we really just need to sum up 20 and 25, right? This is 20 to 25, so the answer is C, right? But let's also look at the A, right? A says that we not only look at the 20 to 25, we also minus everything that's coming back, right? So now the coming back, right? For instance, there's a node an edge that's moving from B to A, right? This contribute to 8, right? There's another one from moving from B to A. This contribute to 11, and so on and so forth, right? So A's intention is that let's discount the things that are coming back, right? So A is incorrect, C is correct, right? So let's just get back to the intuition, right? So I have an island, right? That's really that's originally really keeping A and B in the same island, right? I have a monster that's really chopping things into two halves. Now there are some bridges that are built like across the two islands, right? There are some bridges that are moving from left to right, and there are some bridges that are moving from right to left, right? So now when we talk about the capacity, it's really just that we want to utilize all the bridges that can help us to move water from A to B, right? The fact there are some bridges that are moving backward, right? So say this edge is having 1,000 capacity limit, right? So this kind of backwarding and moving edges are not going to harm us, right? So regardless whether that's 1,000 or 10,000, right? So we can just simply decide to not use this back moving bridge, right? The more important thing is that what we are more constrained are really just the forward going, right? So even if you have so really just imagine that when you want to travel from Williamsburg to New York, right? There are a lot of transportation options, right? You can use flight, you can use trains or whatever ways, right? So we are sort of examining the transportation from Williamsburg to New York, right? So if you tell me that there's a very powerful means to transport from New York back to Williamsburg, say that you can use rocket, yes, you can use rocket or even UFO to transport to move from to New York to Williamsburg. This is actually not a relevant question to us because we really just want to understand how can we move from Williamsburg to New York, right? We only interested in the forward traveling. We are not interested in the backward traveling. So that's the reason that we do not need to subtract all the value that's moving from B to A, right? So long as there are bridges moving from A to B, we just count the capacity of the bridges, right? So we don't care count the capacity of the bridges from B to A, right? So the C is correct, A is not correct, and the intuition is that we don't care about the backward traveling, like especially when we want to collect the min cut with max flow,